All right, so I'm just going to give a very short overview of this research for J.R. Mackenzie. So the starting point for the research was, what is advocacy? It has a bit of baggage around it. For some, it's a bit of a loaded term. It has connotations of radical protest, loud hailers, conflict, tensions, which makes some people a little bit uneasy. So we wanted to look at, well, what does the literature say about what advocacy is? And actually, it's quite simple. Advocacy is making a case for something to people who are in a position to do something about it. And that is at the heart of a lot of what the community sector does. It's a lot of what you are all about. And it usually involves these elements here. So it's about putting a spotlight on an issue, raising awareness. It's about having a really clear cause. It's about raising voices around that issue, and often the voices of people who are not typically heard or who are less visible. Issues of power and control are completely central to advocacy. It's around who has the power, who doesn't, who's in charge, who benefits and who doesn't from a situation. And that also goes to the heart of issues around equality, fairness, equity. So it's a deep and a broad field. So in terms of philanthropy and advocacy, there are three key reasons why it's so important to advocacy. One is that it does get you to root causes. A lot of funders suspect that some of their funding, at least, is going to band-aiding issues, and even in some cases propping up a system that's unfair or broken. So it really is about getting to what is driving systemic inequality and injustice. And it's also a means to have potentially a very wide impact. If you can influence a new policy that touches everybody's lives in the country, that's a massive shift. So it can be especially appealing to funders where there's a compelling issue that's aligned to what they're all about, where there's something that comes up or there's something that can be clearly won or changed or affected. When a funder wants to put something into public awareness or on the agenda, and when there's a real desire to take a stand on something, to stand up for what you feel is right, and also a desire to support people with lived experience or people at the grassroots, the coalface, to lead on an issue. So this question came up about, well, what's our mandate as a funder to support advocacy? And these things came through really strongly. It's about your own vision, your goals and values. It's about listening to your community and the people most affected by the issues you're interested in. It's also an area in which you need to know what you're talking about or understand the context. There are situations where funders can race in and actually cause harm or make matters worse by going in an uninformed way. It's about seeking good advice from people who know what they're talking about, and it's also about your own intuition and gut feel. In advocacy in general, it's a shifting sand, and you really need to get alongside people who can read that landscape and who can spot opportunity and go for it. The thing that most surprised me about doing this research was just how many ways there are to support advocacy. And I suspect that most funders are already doing it, but not doing it consciously. So most people think, oh, we'll fund an advocacy organisation, or we'll try and influence a policy, or we might make a submission. But actually, there's all these ways. And some of the key ways, and most effective ways, is when a funder convenes a conversation. A good example here is with the Voice collaboration, which involved 4 funders coming together. They convened a conversation with people from all parts of the system around children in care, children in state care, and got that system to really grapple with, okay, this is a broken system. How are we going to make some change here? They got legislative change. They set up Voice Whakarongo Mai, which is designed to support those children and young people. That was a a really successful example. Research and evidence for change. So many organisations are doing the mahi every day. They're seeing these issues come to them every day. They haven't got the time or resource to get the evidence around what they're seeing. Funders can fund that evidence so they can make that case. There's a real need in Aotearoa for capacity building, skill building around advocacy, media training, coaching, mentoring, and we have the skills in this country to provide that support. So that's a huge role for philanthropy. There's also examples where funders fund alternative policy development, say with the New Zealand Drug Foundation, drafting policy that is an alternative to what's in place. Supporting groups around legal action. We often have these David and Goliath situations where a group is threatened with legal action, and philanthropy can support those other voices around that. So there's all these other ways, and I think it's a good place to start for a funder to go, well, what are we already doing in this space? We're already in it. And the groups that we are already funding are already advocates. When we look at systems change, we've found, I don't know how many of you have come across the FSG article, Water of Systems Change. It's really gone viral, I think. So they identify these 6 conditions of systems change. So at the top level there, which is around structural change, policies, practices and resource flows, very clear associations between supporting advocacy and policy change, promoting good practice, new practice, but also highlighting poor practice. An example in the Gulf is around sustainable fishing. We want to change those fishing methods. Resource flows. So advocacy gets you straight into following the money. Where is resource going? Who's benefiting? Who's not? How can that be shifted around? In terms of the semi-explicit conditions of systems change, advocacy work is all about relationships, like every kind of work. And it can really support building of strategic relationships that can make a difference together. That's a huge role for philanthropy around advocacy. Advocacy is about power and highlighting power dynamics, influencing decision makers. And this bottom one here, the mentor models, transformative change. A lot of advocacy work is slow, long-term, changing cultural norms, social norms. Look at the child poverty movement. The whole area of movements is in here. So you can see very clear associations between advocacy and those 6 conditions of systems change. I really recommend those 6 conditions as a useful lens for philanthropic bodies to look at what you're doing and also the impact that you're having around systems change through those 6 conditions. We're going to give the slides to everybody who attends, so I don't need to worry about that. Okay, so just some final key messages from this research, things for funders to consider. If you're wanting to be more intentional about your advocacy, you need to make a commitment to that. Often it's a long-term commitment. All these issues are often, they're entrenched, they're complex, they're long-term. Find the people who you trust or build trusting relationships with people to lead. So advocacy is a space where funders stand behind, potentially alongside. You're supporting others to be out there in front. You need to be clear about who's gaining and losing from your support. Really make sure that the people most affected by the issues are front and centre around what's going on. It is a tricky space, so there's no you do A plus B and you get to C with advocacy. You might think, oh, here's a good window to make a change here, and you head off in support of that direction. The landscape changes, and then you feel like you've gone back 10 years. But then, next month it can change again, and off you go. So it's a very shifting ground. You need to be prepared to fail. So Kate Frittberg, who I spoke to, said a trust she's involved in would intentionally support campaigns they knew would fail One was the Campaign for Māori Wards in local government. They just felt really strongly that those voices in that movement was worth supporting. You need to be flexible in your funding to be able to move with the situation. And evaluation can be tricky because attribution saying because we funded X, this has created the change. It's always about attribution with advocacy, and it's more around telling the story and learning about what's going on. Good practice for funders is aligning to your vision, building those trust relationships. As I've said, humility is really key for philanthropists in this space. Wrapping support around your advocates. So J.R. Mackenzie was fantastic at this. They would provide coaching, mentoring, media training, all kinds of support. They'd connect people up. Your processes, they're not the typical fill out a form, contestable fund. You're looking for people who you feel are change makers that you can form those relationships with and fund differently. This issue of the political nature of advocacy, the advice there is to seek to be politically neutral, but at the same time, build those relationships with decision makers, ministers, use your networks and your influence. The most important question is this the right thing for us to be doing? Is it right? It's a moral, ethical, value-based question. And just finally, here's a couple of quotes. So Barrett Meter, some of you might have seen this quote, it's quite well known. So that's about, instead of being at the bottom of the cliff, why don't we move up and see what's going on to cause these issues? And secondly, John Spearings, he was very clear about this in Australia. If you're looking to work in the area of complex issues, you've got to give this a go.